Hello my friends, today let's briefly discuss two shows, Tales of Africa, Papa and Zenu Conte l'Afrique, and African Folktales Reimagined. I watched these sometime last year on Netflix and planned to talk about them sooner, but it slipped my mind. In fact, there's a number of new African shows and movies on Netflix lately that I may eventually do videos on for purposes of both review and recommendation. Alrighty, let's start with Tales of Africa. I think this show can be a good introduction to African folklore. Basically, every episode starts off in modern times with an old man witnessing some issue taking place in some people's lives, and these events remind him of a folk tale, which he then recounts to those around him, which then of course lets us see the events of the folk tale. The reason for this framing device, I think, is twofold. One is to enforce the importance of the oral tradition, and two, it works as a way of emphasizing how one can take the wisdom of these old stories and apply them to our own modern lives. The show's animation quality is not great, but you have to keep in mind that most African films and shows are operating under a much smaller budget than American and Japanese media have to work with. And presumably, if enough people watch more African media, the films and shows from the continent will one day be able to get higher budgets, which presumably would mean that one day we could see buttery smooth Sakuga animation come from Africa, but for now you should support and watch what they have to offer currently instead of just waiting on a possible future. The episode that was most memorable to me was a story with the woman who had a big honkin' nose. It's reminiscent of the Ugly Duckling story, in that this woman with the big ugly schnoz eventually learns that she is in fact beautiful. I think the reason this one stuck in my head so much is because it doesn't really follow the same sort of rhythm that most folk tales do, and therefore subverted my expectations on how its narrative would flow. I'm not sure if that sentence will make sense to you, but just watch the episode and in your head chart out how you think things will work out step by step, and then maybe you'll see what I mean. Anyway, if you have kids or younger siblings, this show for the most part would be good for them to see. However, there's one episode, I think it was the sixth and final episode, had a story that involved slavery. And perhaps you don't want really young kids to watch that. To be clear, it depicts inter-African slavery, which, thanks to the fact that the popular film The Woman King touched upon this issue, hopefully my video isn't the first time you're hearing about this. But yes, some Africans enslaved other Africans, but keep in mind this was long before the modern concept of Pan-Africanism. Anyway, explaining this stuff in detail would derail this entire video, because this obviously is something that deserves a longer explanation. So if you want to learn more on the topic, both Home Team History and From Nothing have videos on their YouTube channels going into detail about this sensitive topic, so you can all hear what they have to say about it. In the meantime, we got another folklore show to talk about still, which is African Folktales Reimagined. This one is not for kids. Only adults should watch African Folktales Reimagined, and if you don't know many African folktales, this should in no way be your introduction to African folklore. Basically, this series was made to put a spotlight on the problem of abuse and violence against women, which is an important issue, but that sure ain't what I was expecting when I first tuned in. Clearly, this show was made for Africans to watch. It's really not a show for Americans. And due to the theme of the show being violence against women, this inevitably paints most of the men of the show in a negative light, because obviously it's men abusing women. And to an African audience, this will be the dynamic that they see. To an American audience, however, since we have so much racial issues in our country, I feel like this will not just make men look bad, but specifically it will make black men look bad. America already suffers from too many negative depictions of black men, so hopefully you can see why I'm saying this really isn't a show for Americans. So yeah, I only recommend watching this if you are among my viewers who are from Africa, or you already are very familiar with many African folktales. After all, the title is African Folktales Reimagined. These are all remakes. It'd be better for viewers to get acquainted with some originals before they look at the remakes. Having said all of that, maybe I'm overthinking things, as I sometimes do. Perhaps I'm worrying too much about how the show portrays black men, because after all, I'm not opposed to a black man being the villain of a story, of course not. Obviously, black men can play both hero and villain. And as I sit here trying to recall the show in my head, I do remember there were a few black men in the show who got to play good guys, so perhaps you can argue that balances things out. I don't know, I'm just kind of giving you my unfiltered thoughts. I did say earlier that we should be supporting said African media if we want to see more, so I guess just watch the show anyway. But watch that cartoon Tales of Africa first, because I think it's a much better intro to the folklore than African Folktales Reimagined is. Though frankly, I would say the book African Folktales, The Pantheon Fairy Tale and Folklore Library by Roger Abrams is a way better introduction than both shows. But I know most people aren't going to pick up a book. But if you're willing to read, that's where you should start. My favorite episode was the one with the masquerader, because of course it is. You know I like masks. Said mask is not a real African mask, but it looks like it was inspired by real African masks, and it's pretty cool looking. So Red Spirit Mask approves of the art direction in this particular episode. And as far as I can recall, the art direction in most of the episodes is perfectly fine. The same cannot be said of my least favorite episode. The first episode of the show starts off well, and I enjoyed much of the plot. On top of that, it's one of the stories that features a heroic black man in it. Since the show is focused on women's rights, he's not the main character, but is instead a supporting character, and that's perfectly fine. If you're trying to uplift women in your narrative, of course the men are not going to be the focus. The main character is a woman named Katara. Katara? Was that how it's pronounced? I can't remember. It's been a while. She gets to kick ass and take revenge on the man who killed her unborn child, which is all well and good. So if I like all that, why is this my least favorite episode? Well, the reason why this episode makes me mad is the art direction in it is f***ing terrible. Specifically, in this episode, there's a gold statue that is a big focal point of the story. It might have been an ancestor figure or a fertility sculpture. I don't quite remember exactly, but either way, that sounds good, right? It does sound good, until you look at it. Look at it!
Who the fuck are you?
Instead of looking like an African figure sculpture, they made this thing look like the Venus of Willendorf, which was found in Austria, a European country.
What the?
Whoever put this in the show needs to be fired. This show, whether I want it or not, is gonna be many people's first experience with African folktales, and yet some dummy thought it was a good idea to visually represent Africa with the art of Europe. Clearly, the art director has no appreciation or love for African art history and prefers European art instead. Fire this person. They don't deserve to work on the show. Now I'm going to get ahead of the comments right now, because I remember a long time ago, I think it was a documentary or something, I heard someone claim that the Venus of Willendorf resembles a black woman. And yes, historically, black people did live in Europe, believe it or not. Every human ethnic group on Earth stems from black people. Humanity, after all, began in Africa. But that point is irrelevant. At the end of the day, whether the Venus of Willendorf represents a black woman or a white woman, she is still European and is still part of European art history and not African history. Plus, Africa has no shortage of sculptures depicting irrefutably African women. Witness her! Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Cameroon, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Egypt, South Africa, the list goes on. Look at her! Look at her! She is the captain now. What, just because I'm an educator doesn't mean I can't do some memes? I'm surprised I didn't swear more during that rant. Oh well, whatever, fuck it. Anyway, now that I got all that out of my system, I guess I don't want to be responsible for getting someone fired, especially if they need the job. So instead of demanding this person be fired, I demand they pick up a damn book and learn about African art history before they are allowed to work on anything else. I suppose I should end on a more positive note, so what I will say about African Folktales Reimagined is that even though I have some issues with how the show was done, especially one very big issue that I just focused on for quite a while, either way, its message is an important message, and hopefully it can inspire some societal changes that can better the lives of African women. Alrighty, that's been my thoughts on these shows. Give them a watch and support African media. Just watch that cartoon first. Yep.